After a fun night out, lawyer Diane arrives at her apartment only to realize she's lost her cell phone. Thankfully, a man called Alexander finds it and calls the number saved as home on the contacts. He admits he saw her leave without the phone, but he didn't stop her because he thought this would be a more fun way to approach her and get a date. Now she can't say no to the idea of meeting because she needs her phone. Diane doesn't get to reply because she notices her bathtub is overflowing, forcing her to hang up. After taking care of that, she receives another call, but this time from her ex-husband Bruno, who wants to discuss the case he plans to take for their firm. While they divorced 3 years ago, they're still working together, which hasn't been easy because of their differences. They've been arguing about this case all day and Diane isn't in the mood for it now, causing her to hang up. Alexander calls her again and notices she's in a bad mood, which inspires him to lend her an ear and listen to her troubles. Diane is impressed by Alexander's sense of humor, charm, and how easy it is to talk to him, encouraging her to accept to meet with him the next day at a cafe. The following afternoon, Diane goes to the cafe and properly meets Alexander, but she quickly feels awkward when she notices he's a midget. Alexander notices her shock yet isn't offended. He tells her he understands and lightens up the mood with some jokes. After Diane gets her phone back and they chat for a while, Alexander asks her to cancel all her plans for the day because he's taking her on an adventure. This adventure turns out to be skydiving, which Alexander quickly makes an appointment for by calling his personal pilot because he's rich. Diane is terrified, but Alexander encourages her to try new things and makes her jump with him. Afterward, Diane is very thankful for the experience because she never felt something like this before, and the two agree to see each other again. Alexander returns to his home, where he lives with a big dog, his son Benji and the maid Monique. Benji is starting to get tired of Monique because she either doesn't do her chores or does them badly, and Alexander thinks he should be understanding because she's sad after losing her husband. Benji points out this has been going on for 5 years, but Alexander ignores him. Later at dinner, Benji tells his father that he turned down a job offer because it wasn't good enough. Alexander thinks anything should be better than nothing, but he doesn't blame the boy for being passionate about his app creation and concentrating on that, so he doesn't mind giving him money for his expenses. The next day at work, Bruno shows up to discuss the case with Diane again. He wants to represent a sleazy man that Diane doesn't like because she wants the firm to have ethics. Still hesitant about their work relationship, Diane asks Bruno for a few days to think about it. Afterward, Diane calls Alexander, who is currently working on a project to expand the opera house. They agree to go out later, and when the secretary Monique comes over to drop some files, she overhears Diane mentioning Alexander's name. In the evening, Alexander takes Diane to an exclusive restaurant not many people know about. The two of them share a lovely dinner together, and when Alexander drives Diane home, the couple kisses for the first time. Diane and Alexander begin seeing each other often, which makes Diane feel extra confident to stand up to Bruno and defend her position regarding their controversial case. She also calls Bruno out, telling him that after being married to him she can't trust him anymore. Bruno notices her change in attitude and wonders if Diane's met somebody, but she denies it. After she's gone though, Coralie comes to Bruno's office and tells him Alexander's name. Meanwhile, Alexander and Benji are having a ping pong match, and they're both quite good at it. When they're done, Benji teases his dad because he looks giddier than usual, and Alexander shares he's met someone, which makes Benji happy to hear. Later that day, a jealous Bruno follows Diane when she leaves the building and sees her get into Alexander's car. The couple spends the night having fun dancing, and afterward, Alexander invites Diane to spend the night at his house, which she accepts. While they're kissing, Diane notices the size difference between them on the mirror Alexander keeps in his room. She can't help feeling awkward and hesitant at the sight, but Alexander quickly takes charge and makes her concentrate on him. Diane manages to really get into it and they spend a lovely time together. The next morning, Alexander has to leave early for work, so Diane wakes up to find a note from him and food waiting for her. While having breakfast, she gets to meet Benji, who shares a bit about his wonderful relationship with his parents. They divorced 10 years ago, but it was a friendly mutual agreement and they still get along to this day. Feeling embarrassed about her own situation, Diane lies and says her divorce was also friendly. Meanwhile at the firm, Bruno tells Coralie that Diane is dating a midget, which neither of them can understand. When Diane arrives, Coralie teases Diane about her new boyfriend, although Diane says it's something casual. Coralie also admits she knows Alexander is a midget, which makes Diane get nervous and wonder if there's something wrong with her. Afterward, Diane goes to see Bruno to discuss the case and he makes fun of her by calling her Snow White. He also wonders if this dating choice is just her trying to experiment. Furious, Diane asks him not to humiliate her and reminds him that they aren't together anymore, so she doesn't owe Bruno any explanations. That afternoon, Alexander meets with his ex-wife for a chat. While they're walking down the road, a man bumps into Alexander and knocks him over, claiming he didn't see him. Alexander is angry and wonders if he's invisible, but leaves without saying much else to avoid causing a scene. A few days later, Diane goes shopping for a sweater for Alexander. Sadly, she can't find his size in adult stores and resigns herself to buying something from a kid's shop, where she turns down the cute bag so she can choose proper wrapper later. In the meantime, Alexander is doing some gift giving of his own. For Benji's birthday, he gets him an interview with a famous app developer that will listen to Benji's ideas for funding consideration. In the evening, Diane, Alexander, and Benji have dinner together to celebrate Benji's success in getting the job. Diane takes the chance to gift Alexander the sweater, making him feel a bit awkward and uncomfortable. It's not because he doesn't like it, in fact he loves it, it's just that he isn't used to people giving him presents. During one of his many work meetings, Alexander has to deal with one of his employees chuckling when he asks them to aim big. Just like Diane felt more confident to confront Bruno, now Alexander feels confident to call out his employee as well, but he also makes sure to lighten the mood with a joke when he's done so the rest of the meeting isn't spent in a tense, nervous mood. Later that night, Alexander finally gets brave enough to ask Diane when she'll stop hiding him. He's introduced her to his friends and families, but she hasn't returned the favor. Diane swears she isn't hiding him, it just happens that she hasn't been seeing her friends much since the divorce. But if Alexander wants to meet her parents, then she'll be happy to introduce him to them. The opportunity comes during a photography exhibition they're all attending. Diane introduces Alexander as a friend to her mother Nicole and her stepfather Philippe, who doesn't speak very well because he's hard of hearing. Alexander charms them all with jokes during the exhibition, then the four of them go to have dinner. Everyone enthusiastically shares stories except for Diane, who keeps noticing how a group from another table keeps pointing at Alexander and laughing. Fed up, Diane goes to them and calls them out on their behavior, causing the group to look away in shame. When she returns to her table, Alexander has gone out to take a call, so Nicole tells Diane she likes Alexander very much. But to Diane's frustration, Nicole refers to him using unkind words, like comparing him to an excitable small dog. After dinner is over and the parents are gone, Alexander has a little chat with Diane to ask her if he can still believe in their relationship. Diane admits it's not easy for her because she's always worrying if she's being thoughtful enough or hurting his feelings. However, she does want to keep trying to be happy with him. Some days later, Alexander visits Diane at the office, eager to see the place where she works. Coralie is welcoming, but she also keeps on being very rude by bending over to talk to Alexander and bringing his glass of water with a straw. Alexander is used to this and ignores it, but it's impossible to ignore Bruno when he arrives, fails to see Alexander, and sits on top of him. Diane has no choice but to introduce them to each other. However, she refuses to argue with Bruno in front of Alexander and takes him to another office. Diane wants to discuss the case, especially since she learned Bruno spent the night with the judge, but Bruno only keeps on calling Alexander names and making fun of Diane's taste in men. Diane won't stand for this though, so she points out that Alexander is an exceptional man and next to him, Bruno is just a bug. This is a brave moment for her. However, when later she goes to the movies with Alexander, she doesn't pay attention and keeps thinking of Bruno's accusations. Alexander notices Diane's weird mood and decides to do something about it. The next day, he finds Bruno in the middle of the street and asks him to leave Diane alone, reminding him they aren't together anymore. Angry, Bruno threatens Alexander with violence, but this isn't enough to make him back off. In fact, Alexander is ready to fight him, but Bruno doesn't want to be seen hitting such a small person and flees the scene like a coward. Alexander still follows him and, after requesting to be adults about this, he invites Bruno to the party he's throwing on Saturday because it would make Diane happy to see them get along. Meanwhile, Diane is in a car with her mother when she finally confesses that Alexander is her boyfriend and that she'd like to marry him someday. Nicole says she's supportive, but this seems to be a lie because her sudden mad driving reveals she's freaking out to the point that they almost crash against a bus. The day of the party, Bruno shows up and is perfectly civil, but Nicole sadly doesn't come. Monique's failing to do her job as usual, which means Alexander has to pick up some food trays and napkins from the kitchen himself. However, the box of napkins is on top of a tall cupboard, so Alexander has to put a bunch of books and a box on top of a stool to reach them. Unfortunately, the box slips and falls with the books, and now Alexander finds himself hanging from the edge of the cupboard. It's Bruno that finds him and makes fun of him as he screams Diane's name to get her to come and see this. Not wanting to be embarrassed in front of Diane, Alexander offers Bruno to solve this in a duel like real men and challenges Bruno to a ping pong match. Bruno accepts, so by the time Diane makes it to the kitchen, Alexander has been helped down and the two men pretend to be just chilling. In the meantime, Nicole expresses her worries about Diane to Philippe, who had already guessed she and Alexander were dating. Philippe doesn't understand why Nicole is worried since he has a disability as well and they're happy together, but Nicole thinks it's not the same because Philippe's disability doesn't show. This double standard upsets and hurts Philippe, who tells Nicole the only invalid here is her. A few days later, Diane goes for a walk with Alexander and they come across a child wearing the same sweater Diane had bought, which gives away where she got it. Later at Alexander's house, he explains he isn't mad, but Diane is still nervous and embarrassed. She doesn't understand how Alexander doesn't hate being short, so he explains this is all he knows, and perhaps he would have hated it if he had been tall first and then shrunk. Diane admits she feels loved when she's with him, that she's learned a lot and that she would love to live together, but she can't. Feeling betrayed after he had been told he should keep believing in them, Alexander breaks up with Diane and kicks her out. After the breakup, Alexander is in a bad mood and, without realizing it, he asks Monique to finish a new chore every few seconds. Monique gets tired of this treatment and leaves, so Alexander ends up vacuuming the carpet himself. That's how Benji finds him when he comes home, causing him to point out that Diane is not worth this grief. He sees Alexander as a great father, his best friend, and a successful architect. In fact, he hadn't noticed anything weird about his dad as a kid, and only caught on to people's attitudes as a teenager. Benji never let it bother him because it didn't bother Alexander. But then Alexander admits it has always hurt and he's lied to himself and his son to be able to move on with life. However, Benji explains those weren't lies. Alexander is strong and has dignity, which means a lot to Alexander to hear. Meanwhile at the firm, Bruno surprises Diane by turning down the sleazy husband to keep up their work ethic. There's a second surprise though, they'll be defending the wife instead. Diane is confused by this at first, but she quickly catches on and guesses Bruno spent the night with the wife. Disgusted, Diane leaves Bruno behind and goes back to thinking about Alexander, who she misses terribly. Neither of them can't stop thinking about the other even if they won't admit it, so one afternoon, Diane finally gets brave enough to show up at Alexander's house with the intention to talk. Unfortunately, Alexander isn't home, and it's Benji that receives her rather coldly. Benji tells Diane she's hurt Alexander enough and asks her to leave him alone before kicking her out. Devastated, Diane returns to the office and has to put up with Coralie calling her an emotional midget. Suddenly, Nicole shows up to comfort her daughter and tell her it isn't too late, she must find Alexander and show him how she really feels. Diane decides she needs a big gesture to prove she's worked on her issues, so she decides to hire a plane and skydive right above the opera house. Unfortunately, she ends up falling on the construction site instead, but Alexander still goes to see her after dismissing his employees. Diane explains she's jumped off a plane as a metaphor to show Alexander she isn't scared anymore. She truly loves him, and she's finally ready to share her whole life with him without caring about what others will say because she's been freed from those misconceptions. Alexander is hesitant at first, but as Diane keeps on expressing her love for him, he accepts to take her back and the couple kisses, ready to start a new chapter of their life together.